Dance, Vanessa said, and the room went quiet enough to hear the ice cracking in 40 champagne glasses. Naomi Bell stood in the center of the marble floor in her gray uniform, hands trembling at her sides, while 60 of the wealthiest people in the state watched and waited for her to become a joke. She had scrubbed these floors for 3 years. She had never once been asked to stand on them. I said dance, Vanessa repeated, louder now, a smile stretched across her face like something borrowed. Somewhere behind the crowd, a door opened, and the man none of them expected for another 2 hours walked in on the exact moment his fiancée decided to humiliate the one person in that house who had never lied to him. Hey, welcome back. Before we get into tonight's story, drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing our story family check in from every corner of the map. If this is your first time here, this channel is home to real, emotionally driven stories about power, dignity, and the quiet people who end up changing everything. Tonight's story is one that a lot of you are going to feel in your chest, so get comfortable, because once this starts, you will not want to look away. This is the story of Naomi Bell, the maid nobody thought was worth protecting, and Julian Cross, the billionaire who walked in 1 second too late to stop the cruelty, and just in time to end it forever. Naomi Bell was 29 years old, and she had learned a long time ago that surviving quietly was safer than being seen. She worked 6 days a week inside the Cross estate, a sprawling glass and stone property on the northern edge of the city, the kind of house that had its own zip code in the local paper whenever it hosted a party. She rose at 5 every morning, before the sun touched the hills, and moved through the house like a shadow that kept everything running. She knew which floorboard in the east hallway creaked. She knew that Julian Cross took his coffee black until November and then switched to cream for no reason he had ever explained. She knew things about that house that the man who owned it did not know about himself. Julian Cross was 38, a name printed often in business journals and almost never spoken with warmth by the people closest to him. He had inherited a struggling logistics company from his father at 26 and turned it into a shipping and real estate empire worth more than most small countries' economies. He was precise, guarded, and exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Success had cost him the ability to trust easily, and somewhere along the way, he had stopped noticing the difference between people who wanted something from him and people who simply wanted him to eat breakfast. Naomi noticed. She always noticed. She left ginger tea on his desk on the mornings he came downstairs with tension behind his eyes. She remembered his late mother's birthday every March and quietly placed a single white lily in the hallway vase without being asked, without ever mentioning why. Julian had caught her doing it once, 2 years earlier, and asked how she knew that flower had mattered to his mother. Naomi had only said, "Some things you just feel, sir," and gone back to her work before he could ask anything else. He never forgot that answer. He never asked her to explain it either. To the outside world, Julian's fiancée Vanessa Calloway was the perfect final piece of his story. Photogenic, sharp-tongued in interviews, the daughter of a hotel dynasty family that had been circling Julian's fortune since long before the engagement. She had met him at a charity auction 18 months earlier, and within 4 months there was a ring on her finger large enough to make the society pages twice in 1 week. What the cameras never caught was the version of Vanessa that only existed inside that house, late at night, when no one important was watching. The version that counted how many minutes Julian spent talking to the staff. The version that noticed, with a jealousy she refused to name even to herself, that Julian Cross laughed more easily around a maid in a gray uniform than he ever had around her in a $5,000 dress. It had started small. A sharp comment here. A dismissive wave there. Vanessa told her closest friend, a woman named Priscilla Okafor who orbited every wealthy circle in the city like a satellite hungry for gravity, that the maid was getting comfortable. Priscilla, who had her own reasons for wanting Vanessa's engagement to succeed, was the one who first planted the idea that would end up detonating everything. "People like that need reminding of their place," Priscilla said one afternoon, swirling wine she hadn't paid for in a glass that wasn't hers. "Otherwise they forget it." Vanessa laughed when she said it. She didn't laugh because she agreed. She laughed because some small, ugly part of her already did. Naomi tried to stay invisible to the tension building around her, the way she always had. She had her own life to hold together outside those gates. A younger brother, Marcus, halfway through a nursing program he was terrified he wouldn't be able to finish once their mother's medical bills caught up to them. A studio apartment 2 bus transfers away from the estate, where the radiator worked maybe half the winter. A quiet, private grief she carried for a father who had died when she was 19, a man who used to tell her that dignity was the one thing poverty could never actually take, no matter how hard it tried. What almost nobody at the Cross estate knew, because Naomi had never once mentioned it, was that she had trained for 11 years as a competitive dancer before her father's death forced her to leave it behind. She had been accepted into a prestigious performing arts conservatory at 17, a scholarship built on nothing but raw talent and a discipline that had impressed even her harshest instructors. She turned it down without telling anyone why, packed the acceptance letter into a shoebox, and took the first job she could find that paid every 2 weeks like clockwork. She kept a single pair of worn ballet flats in the bottom of that shoebox, laces frayed, satin gone gray with age, and she had not put them on in over a decade. She told herself she didn't miss it. Some nights, alone in that studio apartment, she knew that was a lie she'd gotten good at telling herself. The engagement party had been Vanessa's idea from the beginning, and it had ballooned over 6 weeks into something closer to a coronation than a celebration. 200 guests. A 12-piece band flown in from the coast. A dress that had reportedly cost more than Naomi's annual salary twice over. Julian had wanted something smaller, quieter, but he had learned early in the relationship that disagreeing with Vanessa about optics rarely ended in his favor, so he let it grow the way most things around her tended to grow, past the point he was comfortable with. 3 days before the party, Naomi overheard something she wasn't supposed to hear. She had gone into the east sitting room to collect a forgotten coffee cup and found the door half open, Vanessa's voice low and sharp on the other side. "I want her serving drinks in the main hall the entire night," Vanessa was saying to Priscilla. "Right where everyone can see her. Julian's little pet project." Naomi froze in the hallway, cup still in her hand, and for the first time in 3 years, felt something colder than fear settle into her chest. Not fear of losing the job. Fear of what Vanessa might be capable of if a night like this one gave her permission. She almost told Julian. She stood outside his study that same evening for nearly 4 minutes, hand raised to knock, before lowering it and walking away. What would she even say? That the woman he was about to marry didn't like her? Julian had enough weighing on him already, the merger negotiations that had kept him at the office past midnight for 2 straight weeks, the quiet grief that resurfaced every year around the anniversary of his mother's death, which happened to fall exactly 9 days after this party. Naomi decided, the way she had decided so many things in her life, to simply endure it and hope it passed. It did not pass. The night of the party arrived with a sky the color of a bruise settling into dusk, and by 7 o'clock the Cross estate had transformed into something out of a magazine spread, string lights woven through the garden trellises, champagne towers glittering under chandeliers Naomi herself had polished that afternoon. She wore the gray uniform she always wore, hair pulled back, tray balanced perfectly on one palm, moving through the crowd of unfamiliar faces the way she had trained herself to, present but unseen. Julian was pulled into a business conversation almost the moment guests began arriving, a group of investors he'd been courting for the shipping expansion, men who measured every handshake and every silence for leverage. He hated these conversations more than almost anything else his life required of him, but the merger was worth 9 figures, and 9 figures bought a lot of tolerance for boredom. He told himself he would find a quiet 15 minutes to check on things, to breathe, to find the version of the evening that felt less like a performance. He had no idea that somewhere across that same glittering room, the woman wearing his mother's borrowed pearls was about to make a decision that would define the rest of both their lives. It started, as cruelty so often does, with a joke that wasn't really a joke. Priscilla, 3 drinks in and delighted with herself, turned to a small circle of guests and gestured toward Naomi as she passed with a tray of hors d'oeuvres. "Doesn't she carry herself so gracefully?" Priscilla said, just loud enough. "Like she thinks she's one of us." A ripple of laughter, uncomfortable and eager at once, moved through the circle. Vanessa, standing at the edge of that circle with a glass of champagne going warm in her hand, felt something crack open inside her that she had been holding shut for 18 months. She had watched Julian's eyes follow this woman across rooms without him even realizing he was doing it. She had watched him laugh, really laugh, at something Naomi said in passing, the exact laugh Vanessa had spent a year and a half trying and failing to earn from him herself. Actually, Vanessa said, setting her glass down with a click that cut through the small talk around her, I heard she used to dance. The words landed like a spark near dry grass. Naomi, 3 feet away, felt her whole body go still. She had told exactly one person about her past, a fellow staff member she trusted, years ago, in a moment of weakness she had regretted ever since. She had no idea how Vanessa had found out, only that somehow, somewhere, that private piece of her had made its way into the mouth of a woman looking for a weapon. Is that true? Vanessa asked, turning to face her directly now, voice pitched to carry the practiced smile of every society photograph sliding into place. The crowd around them, sensing spectacle the way crowds always do, began to quiet and turn. Naomi's tray suddenly felt impossibly heavy in her hands. Ma'am, I should get back to the kitchen, she said carefully, eyes down, the only defense she had ever needed in 3 years of small daily indignities. It had always worked before. It did not work tonight. Nonsense, Vanessa said, and there was something in her voice now that had stopped pretending to be playful. We have live music. A full band. You should show everyone what you can do. She clapped her hands together twice, sharp as a gunshot, and the 12-piece band, hired for the evening and answering to whoever was paying them, shifted uncertainly into a slow, deliberate rhythm at her signal. Go on, Vanessa said, stepping closer, her voice dropping just low enough that only Naomi could hear the edge underneath it. Dance for us. Show them what a scholarship girl from nowhere can really do. Naomi's hands were shaking so badly the glasses on her tray had begun to chime softly against each other, a small fragile sound underneath the swelling music, and 60 pairs of eyes had turned to watch her decide what she was going to do next. What would you have done if you were standing in that room? Tell us honestly in the comments below, because what happened in the next 60 seconds changed the course of 4 different lives, and almost none of them saw it coming. Naomi set the tray down on the nearest table, her fingers steadier now than they had any right to be, because something had shifted inside her the moment Vanessa said the word scholarship. This wasn't cruelty born from nothing. This was cruelty that had gone digging. Someone had told Vanessa about the conservatory, about the shoebox, about the 11 years Naomi had buried the day her father died, and the fact that Vanessa knew and had chosen this exact moment, in front of this exact crowd, to use it, told Naomi something important. This wasn't jealousy anymore. This was a woman who had decided Naomi needed to be destroyed, publicly, and completely, before the night was over. She could have refused. She could have walked out and let them fire her, let 3 years of quiet loyalty mean nothing, let her brother's tuition become someone else's problem to solve. Instead, Naomi Bell looked directly at Vanessa Calloway for the first time in 3 years of employment, straightened her spine, and stepped into the open circle the crowd had made without realizing they were building her a stage. If they wanted a performance, she decided in that half-second, she would give them one they would never forget. The band, uncertain what tempo to hold, drifted into something slow and classical, and Naomi closed her eyes for exactly 1 breath. When she opened them, something in her posture had changed entirely, the tired exhaustion of a woman who carried trays for a living replaced by a stillness that looked almost dangerous in its precision. She lifted onto her toes, arms rising in a line so clean it silenced the low murmuring at the edges of the crowd, and began to move. It was not the humiliating spectacle Vanessa had engineered. It was 11 years of forgotten training returning to a body that had never actually forgotten how to hold it, muscle memory older and stronger than a decade of scrubbing floors could erase. Naomi turned, controlled and weightless, arms extending into positions that looked less like a party trick and more like something out of a stage in a concert hall built for exactly this. A gasp moved through the crowd, not the gasp of mockery Vanessa had been hunting for, but something closer to disbelief. Phones began rising into the air, capturing footage that would end up online before midnight. Somewhere near the back of the ballroom, a set of investors Julian had spent 2 weeks trying to impress went quiet mid-sentence, drawn toward the open circle by something more compelling than any pitch deck. And that was the exact moment Julian Cross walked out of his study, drawn by a strange hush that had fallen over a party that should have been loud, and saw his fiancée standing at the edge of a crowd with her arms folded and a look on her face that he would spend the rest of the night trying to name. Watching the woman who left ginger tea on his desk every morning transform into someone he had never once been allowed to see. He did not understand the full picture yet, only that something about the scene in front of him felt deeply, dangerously wrong, and that Naomi's eyes, when they briefly found his across the room mid-turn, held something that looked exactly like humiliation being turned, through sheer will, into defiance. The dance lasted perhaps 90 seconds. It felt, to almost everyone watching, like something far longer, the kind of moment that rearranges a room's understanding of a person in real time. Naomi finished with a final turn that brought her back to stillness, chest rising and falling, hands trembling now not from fear but from the sheer physical cost of muscles doing something they hadn't been asked to do in over a decade. For one suspended second, the ballroom was completely silent. Then the applause started, and it did not stop the way Vanessa had clearly expected it to. It grew. Guests who had come to watch a wealthy woman's cruel joke land instead found themselves witnessing something that felt uncomfortably close to art, and applause, once it catches, is a strange and honest thing, impossible to fake at that volume. Someone near the front called out encore, half joking, half not. Vanessa's carefully arranged smile had gone brittle at the edges, the exact opposite reaction of what she'd spent the last 5 minutes engineering. Julian crossed the room before he had fully decided to move, cutting through clusters of guests who parted for him the way crowds always parted for the man whose name was on the invitations. He reached Naomi just as the applause began to fade, and for a moment neither of them said anything, the noise of the party swelling back around them like water closing over a stone. "You're shaking," he said quietly, the first words either of them had exchanged all evening that weren't about coffee or schedules or the small mechanics of running a household. "I'm fine, sir," Naomi said automatically, the old reflex kicking in even now, even after everything. Julian looked at her for a long moment, something recalibrating behind his eyes, and then turned toward Vanessa with a stillness that every person in that circle recognized as far more dangerous than shouting would have been. "What exactly happened here?" he asked, and it was not really a question. Vanessa's answer came fast, practiced, the kind of deflection she'd clearly rehearsed for smaller emergencies than this one. "It was just a bit of fun, Julian. She's talented, obviously, we're all impressed." She laughed, light and social, reaching for his arm the way she always did in front of guests, a gesture meant to signal unity, partnership, nothing to see here. Julian did not take her hand. "You had the band change songs on command," he said, voice low enough that only the closest guests could hear it, though the whole circle was straining to. "You told a member of my staff to perform for entertainment. In front of 200 people. Vanessa's laugh faltered. "I didn't force her to do anything. It was Priscilla, 3 glasses deep and unable to help herself, who made the mistake that finally cracked everything open." "Oh, come on, Julian, it's not like she's actually one of us," she said with an eye roll aimed at Naomi that landed instead directly on Julian's expression, hardening it into something none of the guests had ever personally witnessed before. Vanessa told her to remind everyone of that. That's all this was. The words hung in the air a full second too long before Priscilla realized, with visible horror, exactly what she had just confirmed out loud, in front of a room now recording every second of it on their phones. Julian turned to look at Vanessa fully then, and something in his face had gone very cold, very still. "Is that true?" he said. "Not loud. Somehow worse than loud." Vanessa opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again, searching for the version of the sentence that could undo the last 30 seconds and finding none. Naomi, standing quietly beside him, watched the engagement she had accidentally exposed the rot inside of begin, in real time, in front of 200 witnesses, to visibly fall apart. Have you ever watched someone's true character get exposed in a room full of people who thought they knew better? Let us know in the comments, because the story you think you're watching right now is about to take a turn that none of the guests at that party could have predicted. What none of them knew yet, not Julian, not Vanessa, not even Naomi herself in full, was that this was not simply a story about a jealous fiancé and a humiliated maid. 11 years earlier, the conservatory that had offered Naomi her scholarship had been partially funded by a foundation established by a woman named Eleanor Cross, Julian's mother, a woman who had spent the last decade of her life quietly financing arts education for children whose families could never have afforded it otherwise. The foundation had folded 2 years after Eleanor's death, when the board redirected its funds elsewhere, and most of its records had simply been absorbed and forgotten inside a filing cabinet in a downtown office nobody had opened in years. Naomi had never known the name of the woman behind the scholarship that changed the trajectory of her adolescence. Julian had never known that his mother's foundation had touched the life of the maid asleep 2 floors above his study every night. The connection would have stayed buried entirely if not for the small gold pendant Naomi wore on a thin chain, tucked always beneath her uniform collar, a piece of jewelry so modest none of the wealthy guests in that ballroom would have looked at it twice. It had belonged to her mother, a costume piece from a community theater production decades earlier, worthless in dollars and priceless in every way that mattered. During the chaos of the confrontation, as Julian stepped closer to speak with Naomi directly, the pendant slipped free from beneath her collar, and Julian, without fully understanding why, felt his breath catch in his chest. It was nearly identical, down to the engraving on the back, to a pendant his mother had worn in a photograph that still sat framed on his study desk, a photograph of Julian Cross standing beside a row of teenage dancers at a scholarship gala, one of the last public events she attended before the illness that took her. Julian had looked at that photograph nearly every day for 6 years without ever truly studying the faces in the background. He found himself studying them now, in his memory, with a strange, urgent need he couldn't fully explain to Vanessa, to the guests, to anyone but himself. "Where did you get that?" he asked Naomi quietly, nodding toward the pendant, and something in his tone had shifted so completely from the icy control of a moment earlier that Naomi blinked in surprise. "It was my mother's," she said carefully, unsure why the question mattered, unsure why this man who had just watched his engagement detonate in front of 200 people was suddenly focused on a piece of costume jewelry. "She wore it every year to the gala at the conservatory where I trained. It was the only nice thing she owned." Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What conservatory?" he asked, and his voice had gone somewhere far away from the ballroom entirely. The rest of the party dissolved into a strange, suspended chaos around them, guests whispering, Priscilla being quietly and firmly steered toward the exit by a member of the household staff who had clearly been waiting years for permission to do exactly that, Vanessa standing frozen at the center of a spectacle she had built and could no longer control. Julian and Naomi stood in the eye of it, talking in low urgent voices about a scholarship gala from 11 years earlier, about a foundation neither of them had thought about in years. About a photograph that suddenly felt less like decoration and more like a thread connecting 2 lives that had been circling each other inside the same house for 3 years without either of them realizing it. "My mother funded that program," Julian said finally, something raw breaking through his usual composure. "I didn't even know it was still running when you would have been there. I didn't know any of the names." Naomi felt something cold and strange move through her chest, the particular vertigo of discovering that a stranger's kindness, one that had shaped the entire architecture of her adult life, had a face and a name after all these years, and that the face belonged to a woman whose son she had been quietly pouring coffee for every morning for 3 years without either of them knowing what already connected them. It should have been a beautiful moment. In a different story, it might have ended there, warm and tidy, a coincidence wrapped in gratitude. But Vanessa, watching this exchange unfold in front of her, watching Julian look at Naomi with an intensity she had never once earned in 18 months of trying, felt the last of her composure give way to something far more dangerous than jealousy. She felt exposed, cornered, and humiliated in front of the exact social circle she had spent her entire adult life curating, and cornered people, Julian would learn over the following days, rarely go quietly. The party ended early, guests trickling out in uncomfortable clusters, phones full of footage that would be circulating online by morning under headlines neither Julian nor Vanessa could control. What happened over the next several days unfolded far from the cameras, in quiet rooms and closed-door conversations that mattered infinitely more than the spectacle that had started it all. Julian did not sleep well that night, replaying the ballroom over and over, the sound of Priscilla's confession, the look on Naomi's face in that first frozen second before she chose defiance over collapse. In the morning, he did something he had never once done in 3 years of employing her. He asked Naomi to sit down with him, not across a desk, not with the careful distance of employer and employee, but at the kitchen island where she had left him tea every morning for 3 years without either of them acknowledging what that quiet consistency had actually meant. "I want to understand what happened," he said, and Naomi, exhausted, still raw from the previous night, told him everything, not just about the dance, but about the years before it, about her father, about the shoebox with the ballet flats she hadn't touched in a decade, about the scholarship she had walked away from because grief doesn't leave room for anything as fragile as ambition. Julian listened in a way he realized, somewhere in the middle of her story, that he had never fully listened to anyone in years, too consumed by mergers and quarterly reports to notice the actual human cost of the people who kept his life running. "Why didn't you ever tell me any of this?" he asked, and Naomi's answer landed somewhere he wasn't fully prepared for. "Because you never asked, sir," she said, not unkindly, simply honest in a way 3 years of careful silence had finally made room for. "People like me learn early that our stories aren't really anyone's business unless they're being used against us." The weight of that sentence sat between them for a long moment, and Julian understood, with a discomfort he would carry for weeks afterward, exactly how much of his own household he had never truly seen. Vanessa, meanwhile, had spent the same 24 hours in a very different kind of reckoning. Her family, alerted by the viral footage circulating faster than any of them could contain, had called twice by morning, each conversation colder than the last, less concerned with what she had done than with what it might cost their family's standing. Priscilla, humiliated by her own drunken confession, had already begun distancing herself in the group chats that mattered. The particular cruelty of a social circle that abandons its own the instant loyalty becomes inconvenient. Vanessa found herself, for the first time in years, completely alone with the consequences of a decision made in 5 careless seconds at the edge of a ballroom. She tried, twice, to see Julian that week, and twice he declined, not out of cruelty, he told her the second time through a closed study door, but because he needed to understand something before he could speak to her honestly, and he wasn't ready yet. What he was quietly doing, without telling Vanessa or Naomi or anyone beyond his lawyer, was pulling the old records of his mother's foundation out of storage, tracing the funding trail from 11 years earlier, confirming, line by line, that the scholarship Naomi had once turned down had indeed come from the program Julian Cross built in the final years of her life. It felt, to Julian, like uncovering a piece of his mother he had never known existed, one final gift she had given without his knowledge, to a girl who would end up, through a chain of coincidences too strange to be entirely accidental, standing in his kitchen 11 years later, still carrying her pendant. He spent 2 nights in the archive room on the property's lower level, a space he hadn't set foot in since the funeral, sorting through boxes his father had never bothered to have properly catalogued. He found programs from galas he barely remembered attending as a teenager, thank you letters from families whose names meant nothing to him, and finally, folded inside a manila envelope gone soft with age, a roster of scholarship recipients from the year Naomi would have applied. Her name was there, third from the bottom, typed in a font that had gone slightly faded, next to a handwritten note in his mother's looping cursive that simply read, "Most promising this cycle, watch this one." Julian sat on the concrete floor of that archive room for a long time after he found it, holding a piece of paper that connected 2 people who had lived under the same roof for 3 years without either of them knowing the debt already owed between them. It was during this same week that a second, quieter discovery surfaced, one that would ultimately matter more than any pendant or any dance. Julian's head of household finance, reviewing routine expense reports ahead of the wedding budget finalization, flagged a series of irregular transfers routed through a vendor account tied to the engagement party planning, funds that had been diverted in small, careful increments over the preceding 4 months into an account that traced back, after several layers of obfuscation, to Vanessa herself. Not an enormous sum by the standards of Julian's overall wealth, but a deliberate, sustained pattern of quiet theft that had nothing to do with jealousy or insecurity and everything to do with a woman who had, it turned out, been preparing a financial cushion of her own long before any of this became necessary, the kind of preparation that suggested she had never been entirely certain the engagement would last, and had been hedging accordingly. Confronted with the finance report, Vanessa's explanation shifted 3 times in the span of a single conversation, each version less convincing than the last, until she finally admitted, quietly, that she had been diverting funds for months as insurance, in case Julian ever discovered what she privately referred to as the small things, a phrase that made Julian's stomach turn, understanding only then how many small cruelties and small dishonesties had likely gone unnoticed beneath the surface of a relationship he had let coast on convenience and social expectation rather than anything resembling trust. The engagement ended not with a dramatic scene but with a quiet, exhausted conversation in the same study where Julian had once asked Naomi about a pendant, Vanessa's belongings packed into 3 suitcases by staff who did the work without a single word of complaint, and a legal team quietly negotiating the return of funds that would ultimately spare her formal charges only because Julian, drained by the entire ordeal, chose privacy over public vengeance. Priscilla's carefully built social standing did not survive the fallout nearly as gracefully, her own small dishonesties surfacing in the wreckage the way loose threads tend to unravel an entire garment once someone finally starts pulling. Naomi, in the days that followed, found herself in an unfamiliar position, one where the man who employed her kept finding quiet reasons to ask about her life instead of her schedule, where the shoebox in the bottom of her closet no longer felt like a sealed door but an open question she hadn't let herself consider in over a decade. Julian, without any grand announcement, quietly reached out to what remained of his mother's old foundation contacts and began the slow, unglamorous work of reviving the scholarship program that had once changed Naomi's life. Not as a gesture aimed at her specifically, he was careful to clarify, but because uncovering how much good his mother's quiet generosity had done made him realize how much of her legacy he had let gather dust. Have you ever discovered that a small act of kindness from years ago quietly shaped the entire direction of your life? Tell us about it in the comments, because Naomi's story was about to take one final turn that none of the guests who filmed that humiliating dance ever could have predicted. 3 months after the party, Julian asked Naomi a question that had nothing to do with tea or schedules or foundations. He asked if she would ever consider dancing again, not for an audience, not for spectacle, simply for herself, the way she used to before grief convinced her that dreams were a luxury reserved for people whose fathers hadn't died leaving nothing but debts and a shoebox of memories behind. Naomi laughed at first, the old reflex of deflection, but Julian did not laugh with her, and something in his stillness made her actually consider the question honestly for the first time in 11 years. She started slowly, an hour on Sunday afternoons in the estate's empty ballroom, the same floor where 200 people had once watched her transform humiliation into something closer to grace. There was no audience now, no cruelty disguised as a challenge, just Naomi and the quiet click of her own bare feet against marble, muscle memory returning in pieces, old ache surfacing alongside a joy she had genuinely forgotten was possible to feel. Julian found himself, more evenings than he would have admitted a year earlier, standing quietly in the doorway watching, not out of possessiveness but out of something that had crept up on him slowly enough that he hadn't noticed it arriving, a kind of tenderness he hadn't allowed himself to feel toward anyone since his mother's death. Some Sundays she barely made it through 10 minutes before her body reminded her, sharply, of exactly how many years had passed since she last asked this much of it. Other Sundays something clicked back into place entirely, and for a few unguarded minutes she wasn't a maid or a fiancée or a headline anymore, just a woman moving the way she'd once believed she was meant to. She cried after one of those sessions, quietly, sitting on the edge of the empty ballroom floor, and when Julian crossed the room to check on her she waved him off at first, embarrassed, before finally admitting that they weren't tears of sadness at all. They were the particular grief of realizing how many years she had spent convincing herself that a version of joy this specific wasn't allowed to belong to someone like her. Their relationship did not become romantic quickly or dramatically. It became something steadier than that first, a friendship built on the honest conversations that finally started happening in that kitchen, on Julian learning her brother's name, her mother's condition, the particular exhaustion of holding a family together on a maid's salary while the man she worked for had never once had to think about whether the lights would stay on. It became romantic slowly, the way real things tend to, in the space of small consistent choices rather than grand gestures, in the moment Julian started leaving his study door open instead of closed. In the evening Naomi stopped calling him sir without either of them commenting on when exactly that had changed. A year after the party that nearly destroyed her, Naomi Bell stood in that same ballroom again, but this time the room was empty except for Julian, a small velvet box in his hand and an unsteadiness in his voice that the boardrooms of his empire had never once managed to produce in him. He did not choreograph the moment. He simply told her, plainly, that the woman who had once been forced to dance for cruel entertainment had, without either of them planning it, taught him more about dignity and quiet strength than anyone else in his entire life, and that he could not imagine building the rest of that life with anyone else. Naomi, who had spent a decade believing that her old dreams belonged in a shoebox and nowhere else, said yes, with tears in her eyes that had nothing to do with grief for the first time in longer than she could remember. The wedding, held 8 months later in a converted arts space that had once been part of Julian Cross's original foundation building, was small by the standards of the world Julian had grown up in and enormous by every measure that actually mattered. Naomi's brother Marcus, halfway through his final year of nursing school on a scholarship Julian had quietly funded without ever mentioning it directly, walked her down the aisle in place of the father who hadn't lived to see this version of her story. A dozen young dancers from the newly relaunched conservatory program performed at the reception, not for spectacle, not for anyone's amusement, but because Naomi had asked personally that the program's first graduating class open the night. A small circle closing in front of a room full of people who had chosen, this time, to be there out of genuine love rather than obligation. Vanessa, whose settlement agreement had quietly relocated her to a different city and a much smaller life than the one she'd once been engineering, read about the wedding in an online article months later, a photograph of Julian and Naomi laughing together beneath string lights that looked, she noted with a bitterness that had never fully burned itself out, exactly like the garden lights from the engagement party she'd once ruined trying to protect a version of herself that had never been secure enough to survive scrutiny. She closed the article without finishing it. Some lessons, it turned out, arrived too late to change anything except how a person carries the rest of their life. For Naomi, the lesson of that year never faded, even long after the bruises to her pride had healed and the headlines had moved on to someone else's scandal. She had spent so many years believing that quiet endurance was the safest way to move through a world that had already decided what people who looked like her, worked like her, and grieved like her were allowed to become. But somewhere between a humiliating dance forced on her by a woman who mistook cruelty for power, and an empty ballroom where she rediscovered a version of herself she'd buried out of necessity, Naomi learned that dignity was never actually something other people could take from her in the first place. It had only ever been waiting, quietly, for a room brave enough to actually see it. To everyone watching tonight who has ever been made to feel small in front of people who should have protected you, please hear this clearly. Whatever someone forces you to perform out of cruelty, you always get to choose what that performance becomes. Humiliation is only ever borrowed power, and it belongs, in the end, to the person who refuses to let it define them. Thank you so much for spending this time with us tonight and for walking through Naomi and Julian's story with an open heart. Stories like this one remind us that dignity has a way of surviving even the cruelest rooms, and that the people who try hardest to make us small often end up revealing far more about themselves than they ever manage to take from us. If this story moved you even a little, please hit that like button. It genuinely helps us keep telling stories exactly like this one every single week. If you're new here, subscribe, because we share powerful, true-to-life stories just like Naomi's regularly, and we would love to have you stick around as part of this community. We want to know down in the comments, do you think you would have had the courage to keep dancing the way Naomi did, or would the humiliation have broken you in that moment? And if you have ever had a hidden talent or a hidden strength that someone tried to use against you instead, tell us that story too, because we read every single one. If you know someone who needs a reminder tonight that their dignity was never anyone else's to take, please share this video with them. Thank you for being here, for watching until the very end, and for being part of this corner of the internet that believes quiet strength always finds its moment. We'll see you in the next story.